Um, Good day, Zeinab Badawi. You're a household name in the global media sphere. There's no one who watches international news who would not recognize your face or know your name. How did your media career begin?
Oh, that's going back a long time ago. So my media career really began in a very quiet way. I just went straight from university as a trainee into television. So it was very simple. I didn't study media, I studied politics and economics at Oxford University, and from there I went straight into ITV as a trainee. And that was it. And they trained me on the job.
Why media? What drew you to media? Could it have been influenced by your father who was an editor and who also worked for the BBC?
Yes, that's true.
Service?
Yeah, very, very good point. I've always been interested in current affairs and politics. So my father had also been involved in pre-independence politics in the Sudan. So I think, if you're interested in politics, some people become a practitioner, become politicians, others become observers like me. And I suppose that, yes, there must have been some family influence. And I think you're a very privileged person if you can combine your interest and your passion with your work, which is what I did.
What was your mother in all this?
My mother is a very, very lovely, accomplished, highly intelligent woman. She was a teacher before she got married, and she continued to teach in the Sudan but stopped after she's mother of 6 children. So her career was a bit disrupted when she moved to England, but she comes from a very educated background, and that's because her grandfather, my great-grandfather, pioneered female education in Sudan, and so all the people in all the women in her family, if they were alive today, some of them would be well over 100, could read and write. I've had aunts who've got postgraduate degrees from Western universities who are in their 70s. So she was always a huge, encourager. She always encouraged all her children to aspire to do well. Interesting
you said that. I would come back to your comments much later on. Back to your career path. How easy and difficult was the journey, considering you are an African or Sudanese British?
Yes. Well, I mean, when I started in the media, there were very few people of colour working in the British media. I think that perhaps I entered at a time when there was a sense that they needed to have a greater diversity in the workforce in the early 1980s. There'd been, race riots in England, you remember the Toxteth, in Liverpool, and I think there was a huge discussion. There was a very famous report by a British judge, the Scarsdale report, and I think that I must have just come in on that wave where they felt that people needed to diversify the workforce. So there are a few of us. I mean, it's been a long haul, but this was in the days when there wasn't international news, really, no international channels, and I suppose I've just hung on in there.
How have you found working with the BBC as a black woman?
Well, I mean, really, I'm not in a minority now. Well, I am in a minority, but there are so many of us now. I think I would make a distinction between then and now. I mean, in years gone by when there were very few of us, especially on camera, there was a novelty value. You'd get a lot of attention. But now I think it's really just very standard to see women of colour, black, whatever, on screen. And I think there's a particular drive in the BBC, particularly in the BBC International Channel, BBC World Service and BBC World, to really draw on the first-hand experience of their African, British, British Asian, workforce, because they bring particular insights into covering those particular regions. So we've got, for instance, now in Nigeria, we have a West African correspondent, Mayeni, and that's just a demonstration of how, we are using that talent pool who are from the British black community.
So the next question, what are the challenges you still encounter as a woman and an African in a male-dominated field, vis-a-vis the Carrie Grace's story of
Yes.
campaign for equal pay
Yes,
in media
yes.
houses.
Well, look, the media is no different from any other sector or industry in the economy, it's part of society, and there is, of course, right across, every sector, be it business, be it politics, be it, science, be it the media, that there are gender disparities that need to be addressed. And in the light of the Carrie Grace story, I think, the BBC has responded and is trying to do its best to ensure that there isn't a gender gap when it comes to pay and promotion. And I think for me, it's not a particularly burning issue for me personally, but I support all efforts to make sure that gender disparities are addressed, and I think the BBC is doing that now.
You said something. Why wasn't it a burning issue for you personally?
No, well, I think that I'm of a certain age, and for me, I also have a project which I've nurtured myself, which is for the BBC, of course, my History of Africa series, but it's something that I'm pursuing as my own passion, my own interest, and so I don't work as full-time at the BBC as I used to. So I have, I'm writing a book about African history, so I have other, the discussion was very much about correspondence out in the field, and I'm not one of these correspondents out in the field, so that's why it didn't touch me personally, because I have other projects that I pursue.
Why did you... I watched all the episodes of History of Africa.
Oh, did you? Oh,
except
thank you.
for episode 9 or 10. Why did you decide to shoot the documentary series History of Africa?
Well, it's been a real labour of love. Shall I wait for that?
No, go on.
Is that okay? My postgraduate degree was in history, so I've always loved history personally, as an interest. But I happen to think that African history has been occluded. That means deliberately hidden. It's either been denigrated, occluded, or written by outsiders, or indeed Africans have been told they don't have any history, which is a supreme irony, because of course Africa has the longest history in the world, because it's where humankind originated, and I just felt that needed to be addressed, and so I wanted to bring a popular history to our screens, whereby chronologically and systematically and regionally I would chart the course of African history from the beginning of time to the modern era, also for an African audience, because I don't think that's ever been done before. So if you watch this series, you will know more about African history. You will be, I hope, encouraged to go and find out more, and be entertained as well, in the process. The second series that I'm starting on will focus a lot more on West, Central and Southern Africa than the first series, and I hope to come to Nigeria later this year to film, some of your wonderful kingdoms from the past, and I just think that there was a gap. As I said, it's not been done before. We've had series that have looked at highlights of African history, but never before has it been done in this kind of, chronological, inclusive, systematic way. And also the other thing I do is there have been programs in the past whereby somebody will bring you their own point of view. The presenter, will say the great, wonderful Ali Masruri, we, had Basil Davidson and so on, and they will bring their interpretation. But what I do is I merely act as a facilitator for the African expert themselves or ordinary Africans to tell their own story. So it's also about ownership. I'm not sitting there telling you this is that. But of course I study the history and learn about it, but I'm bringing a Nigerian historian to talk about Nigeria. I'm sort of bringing, you know, a Ghanaian to talk about Ghana. Do you see what I mean? So it's about ownership of the story. Although, of course, we're going so far back, there were not countries as such then, but you know what I mean.
To the next question, what are the challenges you faced while filming the documentary History of Africa series?
Yeah, look, you know, you live in Nigeria, it's very difficult to operate in Africa. You know, getting permissions, sometimes, you know, I go off the beaten track. I don't just go to capital cities, and unfortunately we all know that infrastructure is lacking in Africa. So roads, you know, are very poor sometimes. So there have been logistical challenges like that, physical challenges. And so that has been really, I mean, this is a difficult series to pull off anywhere, but in Africa where transport is really not very great, it has been a challenge, and internal air flights, you know, are not there sometimes. So I would say that that is the greatest challenge. I mean, the country where I was born, the Sudan, is, you know, the third biggest in Africa, and you know, going by road across huge tracts of desert, you know, you get lost. You don't know where you're going sometimes because, you know, there are no roads and sat-nav doesn't work. So I would say that those kind of challenges have been the biggest, really. Once you get, though, to the people and the historians, the anthropologists, the archaeologists, that's the highlight. They're absolutely all wonderful. They all know their subject, have a great passion for it. So that offsets those challenges.
Interesting. What discoveries fascinated and surprised you during the filming of the series?
I think that I was surprised at how rich Africa's history, not surprised, but I was, because I had read about it, of course, I was you know, delighted to see that actually Africa's history is even richer than I had imagined, and also how people integrate you know, historic traditions into their day-to-day lives. So you see that continuity of tradition from centuries gone by, you know, still preserved in people's daily lives is quite remarkable. You know, the ancient kingdom of Kush in northern Sudan, you know, you remember if you saw the series that, you know, I just looked at even the kind of beauty treatments that the women still do, you know, various customs are, you can, the scarification on the face, they found mummies with scarification on their face. So it's extraordinary that you see this continuity of tradition. And I think that's what's wonderful about African history, is that although modernity has been embraced, there is still a real sense of wanting to maintain traditions. So I think that that would be the most interesting observation I'd have to make.
Quite nice. You once said something that while getting the content ready for history of Africa, you spoke with several African elder statespersons.
Yes, yes.
And a lot were surprised by the fact that they knew more of Western history than African history. One of such persons you spoke to, who you mentioned, was
Yes.
How did that strike you?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think that for people like President Obasanjo, and actually this was a conversation that mirrored one I had with my own parents, who were brought up, you know, in Sudan, just as Obasanjo was in Nigeria under British rule. At the beginning, went to school. So of course you had the British education system. So President Obasanjo said to me, I know more about British kings and queens than I do about my ancient history, you know, going way back. You can chant, you know, Henry VIII or whatever. And I think that was the same for my parents. So this idea that once you've been through the British education system during the colonial era, you would really be, you know, have that kind of curriculum whereby your own country's ancient history, not the modern history, but the ancient history, would just not really be particularly emphasised in the curriculum, or if it's dealt with, it's dealt in a very, you know, superficial way. My mother, when I spoke to her, said, oh, we were taken to see the pyramids once, but they didn't know. I now know much more about Sudan's ancient history than my parents ever did. And so, yeah, and I think President Obasanjo was the same, making the same remark. And I found that actually that was something which was echoed by so many people.
Across the...
But actually, even the younger generation, it's not just something confined to the older generation. You know, there's a big movement now, as you know, in South Africa and other places in the world, including in Europe, to decolonize education curriculums. That, you know, there's a difference between the Africanist and the African historian. So the Africanist may be, you know, as a Westerner who studied Africa, and the African historian is an African. So I think that we now need to cast the African historian centre stage. The new Africanists, I mean, are by and large obviously much more enlightened than the old Africanists. So I'm not really doing them down now. There are some wonderful British historians who are, you know, white and so on. And actually I have to say, you know, it's not about colour. Being African is, you could be white, brown or black. You know, Richard Leakey, the famous Kenyan paleontologist, you know, formed the backbone of my first programme. So it's not a thing about colour, it's about being African. That's important.
Quite insightful. The next question, which episode was the most challenging to record or shoot?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I mean, I would say, I would have to say probably Sudan, because of the vastness of the country. It's such a big country and there aren't enough roads. It's where we had the most transport challenges. Egypt was not easy to film in, very bureaucratic as well. So you had to have permits for different parts of the country and so on, you know, Alexandria, Cairo. So I mean, so that I would have to say, yes, I suppose Sudan. Algeria wasn't easy either, particularly because, well, that's now the biggest country in Africa, but it had a very good internal flight system, so we could move around, but a lot of security issues, so everywhere I filmed I had to have 2 police cars with me, everywhere.
Oh, really?
Well, it was just after, you know, I was going, as I said, off the beaten track. It was just after there was a, I can't remember, but some kind of, you know, terror attack or whatever. But anyway, the Algerian authorities insisted that I had a police escort at all times. So, you know, there are security risks and so on.
People would ask, why bother? What was the reason and the rationale behind the project?
Well, I mean, you know, you're right, because it is absolutely a real challenge. I think I like the revelatory aspect of it, that it reveals something that's not been revealed before. It's a unique project because, as I said, it's never been done before. And also working, you know, with UNESCO on this, because UNESCO wrote the General History of Africa, or other African historians wrote the General History of Africa volume. So I derive my facts and my dates and so on, and even some of the academics I interview have contributed to these volumes, the General History of Africa, which is a UNESCO project. It was started back in the 1960s.
So
you know that one, yeah. You know, yeah, you've got that information. So,
what has the feedback been like? Do you think you've succeeded in telling the history of Africa?
Well, look, obviously a television programme cannot do everything, and it would be naive of me to say that, you know, I have comprehensively covered all of Africa's history in this TV series. The first one is, you know, from the origins of humankind to the 12th century. So, you know, but what I have done is to highlight some important aspects, I hope the most important aspects of, you know, a particular history, because I think my main aim is just to stimulate interest in it, because, and I think that television does that well, because it sears the history into the imagination, particularly of young people. You've got to capture their imagination, and TV is a good vehicle for doing that. And then thereafter, I would hope that they would then go and want to find out more by reading books.
Interesting. How long did it take you to shoot the first part of how long did it take you?
Yeah, I suppose we were filming for the best part of 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah, filming, and then, I mean, sometimes we would film and edit at the same time when we got back, but it was, I mean, I suppose from beginning to end, the series must have been about 3.5 years.
Interesting.
Yeah, it takes a long time. The second series hopefully won't take as long, I hope, because obviously there are lessons learned and so on and so forth. But
okay. So the next question, I have to say the BBC HardTalk interview you had with Turkey's president.
Oh, President Erdogan.
Erdogan was quite explosive.
Yes.
Just after what happened in the Middle East.
Yes. Oh, yes, with Syria. Yes.
Syria.
Yes.
Who would you say has been the most difficult personality you've ever interviewed?
Well, I've interviewed so many now. I mean, I think the hardest interviewees are the ones who diffuse tough questions with humour, funnily enough. You know, it's those, because when they deflect a question with humour or accept it, then it's harder. You know, you've got nowhere to go really. So, for example, the Dalai Lama, when I interviewed him and I put to him, you know, questions saying that he'd been accused by his critics of appeasing the Chinese and hadn't really delivered anything much for his people. He said, yes, I know, even my own brother criticises me and says you're a sellout. And so after that, you know, that's a very disarming answer. Desmond Tutu's the same. I said to him, you know, President Mugabe has described you as an evil, nasty little interfering bishop. And he said, did you really say that? And then his shoulders shook with laughter, you know. And so where do you go after that again? So do you see what I mean? Actually, they are the harder ones to do than the ones who sort of, you know, because then you always have got something to come back with. Actually, I laughed when Desmond Tutu laughed. Because his laugh is very infectious. So do you see what I mean? So it's probably not the answer you were expecting in terms of, but I mean, you know, I think when you have a Nobel Prize winning economist that you have to interview on HardTalk, of course that's a challenge, like Amartya Sen, the Indian Nobel Prize winning economist. You know, you're sitting engaging with a great mind, you know, an intellectual giant, but you still have to sit there and hold your ground. So that's another example of a difficult one.
To be honest and forthright, Zeinab, I want you to be honest and forthright here. Who are the personalities you tried to get on the BBC HardTalk who have refused to do an interview?
Well, I mean, the American leaders are never very good. I mean, I don't even know if we have a bid for President Trump, but we've never had an American president do HardTalk.
Not even Obama?
No, not even Obama. It'd be wonderful to have President Obama. If you're listening and you're reading this, President Obama, you can find me at the BBC. So they tend to be the ones that we don't get.
What about African leaders?
African leaders are not too bad.
Who have avoided BBC HardTalk?
Yeah, I mean, actually, a lot of them are quite amenable to it. President Kagame I've interviewed, I think, twice on HardTalk now. Recently, actually, President Adama Barrow of Gambia, just about 6 weeks ago. I mean, I think that there are Meles Zenawi, the late Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, Cyril Ramaphosa just earlier this year. I mean, there are a few, and President Peter Mutharika of Malawi. I mean, there are quite a few I've done over the years, and there's always, I think there's always a lot of respect for African leaders who do HardTalk. President Buhari has not accepted my request. If you're reading this, President Buhari, you know where to find me.
Okay. Interesting. Quite.
President Obasanjo has done HardTalk.
Quite revealing.
Yeah.
During the 25th year anniversary of BBC HardTalk, the past and present presenters met.
Yes.
And you said Nigeria's former president, Chief Olusegun Obasanjo, was one of your most difficult guests.
I don't think I said that. That wasn't me.
Why so?
I don't think I said that. Was that one of the others? Must have said that.
I know you said it because I was.
Did I really?
Anyway.
I don't think I did. Yeah, no, I don't think so.
To the next question.
Yeah, I don't think I did. I think that somebody else made reference to that, maybe Stephen. But if I did, I can't remember. Sorry.
Do you think African governments should dabble into funding media expansion?
African governments?
Yes.
I mean, look, the BBC is, people often say to us that the BBC gets government funding, which it does through the licence fee, not BBC World, the section that I work for. BBC World Service also gets a grant from the government. But I think one has to make a distinction between a state broadcaster and a national broadcaster. The BBC is very much a national broadcaster, so it's all over the nation of the United Kingdom. And if you have a national broadcaster whereby the government just facilitates a broadcast station, radio, TV, to be a national broadcaster and doesn't interfere and have their very strong, rules that ensure editorial independence, then I think it's all right. I couldn't say to you that it's wrong, but what would be wrong is if there was government funding for a state broadcaster, so that it just becomes another organ of the state, a propaganda mouthpiece for the government of the day, and that would be wrong. And that is not the BBC. It's a national broadcaster, not a state broadcaster.
Just as an African who has lived in the West for over 5 decades.
Yeah.
Why do you think the African narrative as portrayed by Western media sometimes seem to be negative?
Well, I mean, I think that news is inherently always going to be looking for difficult stories. So it's not just Africans who suffer from this, perception. If you think about our coverage of any part of the world, it's the old saying, man crosses the road safely is not news. A man crosses the road, gets knocked over by a car is news. So it's just the nature of news on the whole. There has been a bit of a pushback now for people to say that actually this is too unidimensional. You need a more multidimensional approach to covering news, and that there has to be shade and light when we cover stories. And by and large, I think if you look at BBC bulletins now, they will have, stories, human interest stories, people who've succeeded against the odds, or even if that's not in the news bulletin, there'll be programmes that provide that kind of outlet. I mean, my history series, in a way, is a celebration of African culture. There's, of course, there are wars that I would talk about and so on, but I mean, that is giving a more multidimensional view of Africa. However, having said that, I think that this kind of approach is all right when viewers in the West, for example, if you do a story about London and there may have been, the terrible Grenfell Tower tragedy, people may know more about London, and they know that that Grenfell Tower disaster is not the only thing that defines London. There are many other lovely things that go on in London, and so people are able to fill in, other views of London. Do you see what I mean? But when people are watching reports about Africa, which may all be, about coups, wars, famines, whatever, they may not have any other first-hand experience of African countries, because they may not have visited, especially, in the days when globalization wasn't around and mass travel wasn't available. So that negative becomes the whole, because they're viewing in a vacuum. They don't have any other thoughts to challenge it. So it becomes, the part becomes the whole. And that's not so true of the West. So, if they're watching America and there's some tragedy that's gone on, a shootout or whatever, they know that that's a problem in America, but they also know that, you can go shopping in Manhattan, you can go to California and, surf on the beach or whatever. Do you see what I mean? So it does mean that Africa does have a bit more of a problem in that regard. And also, I think coverage of Africa has become now very much inextricably linked with the migration issue. And so when Western nations see Africans coming in or wanting to come in, they are perceived as kind of needy outsiders, and that may reinforce their attitudes about Africans who are settled and have been settled for a long time. It becomes, do you see what I mean? It becomes, so an international migrant issue becomes something that has an impact on the social, domestic, political agenda, and has an impact on settled African communities or black communities in Europe.
Interesting. Back to a comment you made much earlier on. Isn't it striking that your great-grandfather was one of the pioneers of women's education in Sudan?
He was the pioneer. There was nothing before. Yeah, he was the one.
Pioneer. And if such awareness was prevalent in Sudan more than a century ago, what do you think has happened to present-day Sudan and the empowerment and education of women?
Yeah.
If someone like that could be so open-minded.
Actually, Sudanese women, historically and even to this day, do assert themselves very much on the, the country's agenda. I have, very strong female role models in my family. I mean, not all women are like that, of course. They're from the elite, they're educated, but there's certainly space for them in Sudan to, but like everywhere else, of course, every society is patriarchal, and the United Kingdom has got 25% of parliamentarians are women. It's 23% or something. It's not great. So it's the same in Sudan. Obviously, you don't have enough parliamentarians who are women. You don't have enough women business leaders. But by and large, there is space for a woman to flourish if she wants to. Obviously, there are more conservative, communities. But luckily, I don't come from such a community. We've always, as I said, had women who wear the trousers in the family.
Really?
Well, not literally, but I mean the women who are, women who, the girls are as encouraged as much as the boys to go to school, to do as well, so I'm fortunate in that regard. But I would say that it's not just my family. I would say that it's not impossible for women to flourish. I mean, of course there are terrible cases like this young woman Noura who was forced into a marriage and tragically, killed her husband and so on. And that's, I'm glad to see her death sentence has been rescinded. But of course there are cases like that.
Just to a not so personal question. Have you ever been subtly, covertly or overtly threatened by a personality?
No.
Or have you ever felt threatened by a personality during the course of your work?
No.
Never?
No. Maybe I'm too tall, they're too scared.
Interesting. Interesting. Some might want to ask, what makes journalists like you think you really know about countries when you analyze or ask global leaders certain tough questions?
Well, I mean, I've been in the business for such a long time. I'm fortunate that I have studied politics and international relations and economics and philosophy. So for me, luckily, I did have a kind of framework when I went into this business. So if I have to interview somebody about economics, I can remember the economics I did at university, which has provided me, luckily, with a very good framework. And I've been in the business such a long time that there's nothing that is completely new to me, because obviously, there's just an extra layer you have to add each time. So South Africa, interview Cyril Ramaphosa, it's just getting the later developments. But I mean, I always do my homework. We've got a wonderful research team, producers at HardTalk who will get their research, double check their facts and so on. And we really do our fact checking so that anything I put to the interviewee, we make sure it's true and it's corroborated. And on HardTalk, we tend to, it's not my opinions I'm advancing, we're attributing criticisms to third parties. So-and-so has said about you. So if the interviewee doesn't accept it, you can say, well, so-and-so is wrong. But that so-and-so person may be the United Nations Secretary General. It may be somebody who's been the victim of, abuse of some kind or whatever. So we are, using their experiences to put that point of view forward.
Quite insightful. A few more questions to go. What makes BBC Global Questions unique?
Yeah.
And why having it in Lagos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Global Questions is unique in the BBC World TV firmament. There's something similar on British TV, but ours is unique because it travels all over the world, and it brings in people not only from the country but sometimes from a region. You know, in Britain we have a program called Question Time, but that just is a local audience, a British audience. So, for example, you know, if we didn't do it in Nigeria, we did this very much as a Nigeria focus because Nigeria is so big. But you know, we went to Cambodia, and we might have had last year. We might have got somebody from Vietnam or whatever. So that's what makes it unique. That it often offers a regional as well as a national perspective on a story. Nobody else is doing it, whereby we bring citizens together with their leaders or influential opinion formers or whoever to put their questions to the panelists. So it's a real exercise in encouraging citizens to hold their leaders to account, to demand transparency in their actions, to ensure that, you know, their grievances or their views are being presented, and it forces the panelists, who are, as I said, either politicians, opinion formers or whatever, to really understand where the mood is amongst their particular people. And we brought it to Lagos because it's the most populous city, of course, in Nigeria, and because Nigeria is, of course, a very, very important country. 1 in 4 Africans are Nigerians, and it is an important country not only for Africa but globally. And I mean, you know, Africa cannot succeed if Nigeria does not succeed, and any failures that Nigeria has are also shared by all of Africa, because you are such a, you know, big part of it, and also in the diaspora. So I think those were the reasons why we felt that Nigeria was a very good country to focus on this global questions, and particularly on the youth, because obviously Africa has a very youthful population, and in Nigeria as well, obviously. So they're the reasons why.
What next for Zeinab Badawi? You have Kush Communications.
Yeah.
Do you intend to set up like a big media conglomerate?
Oh, well, I don't know. I have to get through the history of Africa first and my books for children, and then we'll see. Yeah. But if there are any nice Nigerian investors out there, they can come and find me, and we can discuss.
Which brings me to my last question. Talking about books, what is the title of the book you're currently reading?
But you know, the Africa History series is really, you can't really understand it unless you're 19, 18, 19. So I'm just going to do books for younger children, 11 to 12-year-olds, because I think catch them young, get them interested, you know, so that they know that they have a history, so they don't think that African history started with slavery and the arrival of the European colonial powers. I think that's something that's very important, and so that's why I'd like to reach the younger generation. I'm a mother of 4 children myself, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and I can see that there is a kind of curve that it's a good time to catch a child at about 10 or 11 to capture their imagination. So I'll do heavily illustrated books. I'm talking to publishers now, and that will keep me busy for the next 2 or 3 years. Then I'll be an old lady by then. I can retire in the sun somewhere.
Speaking of books, what's the title of the book?
Oh, it'll be The History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi, the same as the series,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But in the children's department. Thank you very much indeed. You're very thoughtful.